Okay, good evening. Hope everybody can hear me. This is Dr. Soul Brother. And what I'm going to be doing today is paying homage to Malcolm X, aka El Haj Malik El Shabazz, brother Omar Wali, who was born May 19th, 1925. My reason for going into this is because I think it's very, very important that more of us understand who he was and what he represented. Too often, um, when people talk about Malcolm, they talk about him in ways that sound almost simplistic. For example, when they talk about Malcolm, they talk about him within the nation of within the context of the Nation of Islam, and that's important because he did put in 12 years in the nation as the minister, and also he served as a national representative. So clearly, that's important to know and to recognize. However, um, I think it is also key to know and understand that um, the evolution of Malcolm needs to be highlighted. And when I talk about the evolution of Malcolm, I'm not just talking about the fact that he went to Mecca. That's a part of it to be sure. But what I'm talking about is when he um, when he made his pilgrimage to Mecca, he also um, spent time in in Africa, in other parts of Africa, and that's important to know and understand. So let me go on and explain what I mean by that. The thing is this. Well, let me go start from the beginning. Malcolm X was somebody who um, he would go into. Um, let's go this. He was born May 19th, 1925, and he was born um, to Reverend Earl Little and Mrs. Louise Little. His father, Reverend Earl Little, was from Reynolds, Georgia. His mother was from originally from Grenada. The mother and father met in Canada because there was a point when his mother left Grenada and went to live in Canada. And let's be clear, both parents were Garveyites. Okay, so that's what we were dealing with there. Um, the thing is this: um, he was somebody uh, who his father was a race man and his mother was a race woman. And also, I might add this: from what we understand, his father was um, a Prince Hall Mason, and his mother was um, uh, a Eastern Star. So they were clearly rooted in that tradition here in the Afro American tradition. Now, I'm going to talk about and want love to get your feedback on this. Um, the whole thing with um, his father being an activist as well as a Baptist minister. I failed to mention that part. And that's significant because too often when people talk about um, ministers and the black church, they tend to lampoon them. And that is highly problematic. Now, yes, do you have those who um, were not doing what they should have been doing? Yes, but guess what? The history of the black church, you really going back to slavery because during slavery time it was called the invisible institution. You had people like um, Papa Nat Turner and others on the plantation who were deep in their faith. And matter of fact, they used their faith as a way as a bridge over troubled waters. Now, um, when Malcolm X was a little boy, at the time that Reverend Earl Little was killed, um, Malcolm was 6 years old. However, Malcolm, as a young boy, remembered being with his father when his father would speak and would clearly deliver a fire and brimstone message as a Garveyite, and as a Garveyite, um, to for those listeners who don't know, that is the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association organization founded by Mr. Marcus Garvey, who came to America from Jamaica in 1916 and was arrested and jailed and ultimately deported in the 1920s. He deported back to Jamaica, which is a story in and of itself. But getting back to Malcolm X and his family, I think it's important to know and understand this: that again, while Malcolm's father was uh, a Garveyite, he was somebody who was a race man, and it only makes sense when you think about it that he would be um, a race man there. Now, um, Malcolm was born May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. And the Ku Klux Klan burned down their home and they had to flee and ended up different places in the Midwest and ultimately ended up in Lansing, uh, East Lansing, Michigan. Well, the thing is this: um, it should be noted that the Ku Klux Klan saw Reverend Earl Little as a threat, and um, it was said that there was a conspiracy to kill Reverend Earl Little. Now, there's a book that is out. It's been out for, I want to say, 2, maybe 3 years now. The Dead Are Rising, and the author is Mr. Les Payne. He was a black journalist um, who ultimately passed away, unfortunately, 2 years prior to the publication of the book. But his daughter, Tamara Payne, ended up finishing the book for him. Thank heaven. Well, what needs to be noted is this: that in that um, in that book, it cited that it may have been an accidental death when Reverend Earl Little was trying to get on a trolley car and slipped and was injured. So it may or may not have been um, a murder, as Malcolm X had always stated. But that's a conversation for another day. I want to go into the role that his mother played being a secretary in the UNIA. In fact, she wrote for the Black World newspaper. You see, Mrs. Louise Little, I said, was a race woman, similar to her husband being a race man. And what ended up happening, um, even though she suffered as a result of the death of her husband, she continued to teach her children race pride. They got exposed to um, things that were happening internationally, like in Grenada and other parts of the Caribbean. So they had an internationalist view, which was good and important. Um, I want to say here that I couldn't help but notice in today's environment, there's a tendency to act as if because his mother was from Grenada, a part of the Caribbean, um, that Malcolm was the race conscious person that he was, and simultaneously either um, leave out altogether his father or reduce his father to a footnote, and that's a problem. In other words, you have people who try to use Louise Little's Caribbean background as a weapon against African Americans, and that's highly problematic. Not to mention insulting. Um, so Malcolm X goes along, and I won't go into too much detail because I'm sure those of who have read the his autobiography know the story very well. But here's the thing: um, we know that Malcolm got caught up in uh, crime as a youngster once he moved to Boston to live with his sister, his oldest sister, from um, from his father's first marriage, Ella. and he was drawn to the streets. He became a hustler and all the rest of it, and ended up in prison. And while in prison, his siblings, who had converted to the Nation of Islam while he was locked up, um, what they did was try to convert him, and they worked on him through one of the brothers named Reginald. And Reginald was the one who introduced him to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. You know, they considered the Nation of Islam the black man's religion, quote unquote. And Malcolm became a convert in the late 1940s. I want to say 1948 to be exact. He gets paroled in 1952, August of 1952, and becomes a full fledged minister in the Nation of Islam. He goes around fishing, so to speak, and is able to convert people. One of the things that needs to be noted is that um, what ends up happening is the whole thing with um, Elijah Muhammad, who had served in prison himself because from in the 1940s during World War II, he served because he refused to fight in World War II. So as a result of that, he became, as it were, a, um, a political prisoner. A lot of people, when they talk about political prisoners, they tend not to mention or refer to Elijah Muhammad as a prisoner, as a political prisoner, but that's essentially what he became or what he was. So Elijah Muhammad was convinced that some of the best convicts, I'm sorry, some of the best converts were from the penitentiary because he started recruiting from the penitentiary. In fact, one of the men he recruited while locked up was a man who became known as James Shabazz. His 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 last name uh, escapes me right now, but um, it'll come back to me. But at any rate, he became James Shabazz, and he became a minister in the Nation of Islam. But this is somebody who Elijah Muhammad got to know and converted him while locked up in the penitentiary. And of course, Malcolm X, coming from the penitentiary, became one of his best converts. Here's the thing, and I want to address that real quick. Most of the people who joined the Nation of Islam were from the working class. They were not college educated folk. Some of them had, a lot of them had limited formal education, if a high school diploma, um, high school diploma or less, put it that way. That began to change once Malcolm hit the ground running out of the penitentiary when he was paroled. There were people who were drawn to him and the Nation of Islam, uh, even those who were college students. Now, when I say this, that's not to say that college students automatically joined the Nation of Islam. They did not. They were, at the very least, drawn to the political message of Malcolm X, not the religious message there. You had people who you know as Huey Newton, Bunchy Carter, Ray Masai Hewitt, and others who were drawn to the political message coming from Malcolm X, not from Elijah Muhammad. And those three individuals I mentioned, none of them, well, with an exception of Bunchy. Bunchy did join the Nation of Islam as a teenager in the late 1950s, but that's a conversation for another day. But here's the thing. Generally speaking, they did not join. Like Bobby Seale, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, he didn't join the Nation of Islam. By his own admission, he was drawn to the um, political message of Malcolm X. So that's more of a secular thing. But here's the thing. What ends up happening is that, um, and this we'll see how this plays out in the next decade in the 1960s. When you had just regular poor working class people in the Nation of Islam, things were a little different. Not perfect, but things were a little different. Things shifted when you started, and I'll have to use Marxist language here, the lumpen proletariat in the Nation of Islam. That's when the trouble started. And we saw that happen in the 1960s towards the end of Malcolm's sojourn in the Nation of Islam. One could have said, well, what happened with Malcolm? Well, when Malcolm, though it's true, he was a part of the um, lumpen proletariat, he was not raised in the lumpen proletariat. In other words, His parents were not part of the lumpen. They were part of the working class, to be sure, but not the lumpen. And so, though Malcolm became a wayward youth, at the same time, he um, was once he was met with the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, Nation of Islam, it triggered something in him because that race consciousness had been laying dormant, and all the teachings of the Nation of Islam, as taught by Elijah Muhammad, all that did was reignite that. So that was already in him. Anyhow, um, I think it's important to note, and I want to focus on this for a number of reasons. Um, I want to talk about Malcolm and his metamorphosis. Now, again, as I stated at the beginning, a lot of people talk about Malcolm and his, um, you know, Mecca trip and all that. And see, you have to understand something. When he went to Mecca, he was no longer in the Nation of Islam. He was converting to Sunni Islam. But that was a spiritual journey. The political journey gets social and political, I should say, gets reduced to a footnote if acknowledged at all. And that is, yes, he was growing internationally. It developed more of an internationalist outlook, but also he was focusing on things that ran counter to the teachings of the Nation of Islam. For example, the Nation of Islam has taught against voting. Well, Malcolm, when he was no longer in the Nation of Islam, was promoting voting. The Nation of Islam gave pushback to the American identity. Malcolm embraced it. For example, the nation talked about under Elijah Muhammad talked about the so-called American Negro. So-called. Well, um, and they never used the term American, and they never used the term Afro-American. When American is your nationality, um, and what is your ethnicity? Afro-American. So as time progressed, we saw where Malcolm was embracing that. I'm going to cite something real quick. Now, if anybody has gone through Malcolm's autobiography, and I find this curious that with the Malcolm X scholars and academics, that what I'm going to cite to everybody here, that people this seems to go past a lot of folk, and the fact that it's not brought up, cited, is problematic. And I have my own theories as to why it's not cited. But there's a part in his autobiography where he travels. Of course, they deal with him traveling to Mecca and all that, but he's also in Africa. And one of the things um, that I find interesting is that it wasn't until I've read the book several times before, but sometimes when you read things again and certain things shoot out at you that didn't shoot out at you before. Well, this one did. I'm looking for it as I'm talking, so please bear with me. I wish I'd had this together before, but I'm just going on. Okay. Is it here? I'm gonna find it. Please bear with me. Oh, here we go. Here we go. In the chapter El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, please go to page 359. And there's a part in here where Malcolm X says, and I quote, he says, quote, I stressed to the assembled press the need for mutual communication and support between the Africans and Afro Americans whose struggles were interlocked. I remember that in the press conference, I used the word Negro and I was firmly corrected. Quote, the word is not favored here, Mr. Malcolm, excuse me. The term Afro American has greater meaning and dignity. End of quote. I sincerely apologized. I don't think that I said Negro again as long as I was in Africa. I said that the 22 million Afro Americans in the United States could become for Africa a great positive force, while in turn the African nations could and should exert positive force at the diplomatic levels against America's racial discrimination, I said. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because when Malcolm X is over in Africa, um, he was given pushback when he was using the term Negro. And an African corrected him and said that the word is not favored here. And he said that the term Afro American has greater meaning and dignity. And notice when he returns to America in May of 1964, and then in June of 1964, the following month, what does he do? He does what? He presents to everybody the Organization of Afro American Unity that is modeled after the Organization of African Unity. And in that, listen to the title, Organization of Afro American Unity. So Malcolm is embracing his Afro American identity as distinct from so called American Negro. Now, I'm going to go to Malcolm X, The Man in His Times, edited by John Henry Clark, somebody I wish I had the opportunity to have met many years ago. If you go in there, you'll see the eulogy delivered by Ozzie Davis at the funeral of Malcolm. And what did I'm not going to read the whole thing, of course, but what did he say? He said, he said, for Harlem has never been gracious to those who have loved her, have fought for her, and have defended her honor even to the death. It is not in the memory of man that this beleaguered, unfortunate, but nonetheless proud community has found a braver, more gallant young champion than this Afro American who lies before us, unconquered still. I say the word again, as he would want me to, Afro American. Afro American Malcolm, who was a master, was most meticulous in his use of words. Nobody knew better than the power words have over the minds of men. Malcolm had stopped being a Negro years ago. It had become too small, too puny, too weak a word for him. Malcolm was bigger than that. Malcolm had become an Afro American, and he wanted so desperately that that all his people would become Afro Americans too. That's Ozzie Davis. So, Malcolm had embraced his Afro American identity after all that time. During his time in the Nation of Islam, those 12 years he served, he was not embracing his Afro American identity, but as he was metamorphosizing, he was embracing it. Now, I want to go into this here. I want to talk about the after Malcolm's assassination. Malcolm, in death, had an influence on the creation of the Black Arts Movement. There are people who are still around. There are those who have since passed on who were part of the Black Arts Movement. Black Arts Movement started in 1965. You had certain people like um, Sonia Sanchez, a man named Don Lee, who later became Haki Matabuti, um, Leroy Jones, who became Amiri Baraka. As a matter of fact, it's my understanding that Malcolm's assassination had such an impact on him that he um, changed his program and gravitated towards black nationalism and then more cultural nationalism and all the rest of it. This is Amiri Baraka. Now, while the black arts movement embraced its Afro American identity, there were other things pertaining to the Afro American identity that um, that they embraced. For example, this whole thing with soul food. People who were part of um, the Black Arts Movement embraced. And this is at a time when the term soul was coming into being and was, for example, yeah, soul. The term soul was becoming popular, and also soul food. Now, back in the day prior to that, in fact, if you go through Malcolm's autobiography and he's talking about as a youngster, he's sitting down working out at the dinner table where his sister Ella had prepared a plate of, in those days, back in the 40s, they didn't call it soul food, it was called down home cooking. And it later became known as soul food in the 60s. Well, people in the Black Arts Movement embraced that. They were not people who were pushing vegetarianism or veganism, they were embracing soul food. And they were also embracing other parts of our culture in America. Um, and if you weigh it on a scale, a lot of the stuff that they were uh, getting into, uh, there were things that the Nation of Islam did not embrace. For example, the Nation of Islam referred to soul food as slave food. Okay, let's be clear. They were very critical of the. Now it's true that you had those in the Nation of Islam who did not eat pork. But as Muslims in the Muslim religion, they don't eat pork, and just like they don't eat pork in the Jewish faith. But um, and at some point, I'm going to do a program on soul food, and I would definitely welcome the audience in that. But I think it's important to know and understand that when it came to um, the metamorphosis of Malcolm X, that right there is key about him embracing his Afro American identity in the latter part of his life, something that he was taught in the Nation of Islam to reject, to reject. And I think people need to understand that um, many of you who reject the Afro American identity and all those things, customs and whatnot that come with that identity, you've been influenced by either the Nation of Islam or other people, like let's say the Hebrew Israelites, or say the people who would be. You don't so much hear the term now, but back in the day, like 30 years ago, you heard the term Afrocentricity and all of that. And so with that would also come things like um, the slave, um, uh, quote unquote, slave identity, and also the faith. They were going on the faith, all those kind of things. Now Malcolm was assassinated February 21st, 1965. I'm not going to go into that because again, we want to recognize his birthday. So I'm going to end it on a positive note, not a negative one. And that's definitely a tragedy. His assassination was a tragedy of great proportions on so many levels. But again, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But what I will say, when you look at Malcolm, you look at um, um, what he represented, look at his metamorphosis, you have to look at how he was constantly evolving. And in his evolution, he was doing what? He was um, coming back around to the identity that he had from his childhood, and that was the Afro American. Okay. So that is something that I would hope and encourage and urge people who call themselves Malcolm X scholars, as well as not just Malcolm X, but academics, to please go into that because I think it's very important to um, to understand the evolution of the man, and that to me is something that people talk about the thing with Mecca and all that's good and important and real. However, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a spiritual journey and not a political one. So I'm going to end this now and say that this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and I just wanted to use this time to commemorate his birthday. He would have been 98 years old had he lived, and more people need to know who this man was, what he stood for, uncompromising. So when you think of Malcolm, you don't just look at the fact that he was a fiery orator. That's a part of it to be sure, but also his metamorphosis, his true metamorphosis. And once I fundamentally believe that if more of our people really understood where Malcolm was coming from in his metamorphosis, that we could take a serious page out of his playbook. And on that, this is Dr. Soul Brother ending it. And please, those of you out there hearing me, please hit the like button and subscribe button. That's very important. And I'm looking at possibly next week doing a show. Well, I won't spoil it, but it'll be an important one, and it will tie into our history again. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and long live the spirit of Malcolm X, aka El Haj Malik El Shabazz.